a country brought to a standstill and a government on the brink. As JNIM fighters blockade the capital, cutting fuel supplies, the ruling military junta struggles to contain the fallout in Mali. Can the regime survive, and do the insurgents now have the upper hand? I'm Hazem Sika, and today's newsmaker is Mali. For millions of Malians, it's been a struggle to keep the wheels of daily life turning. Lines of vehicles wait behind petrol stations, schools have shut, hospitals are rationing power, and civilian movement has virtually ground to a halt. The Al-Qaeda-linked armed group JNIM has been fighting an insurgency against the government in Mali for more than a decade. Their tactics have recently shifted to choking off fuel supplies into the capital, Bamako, blowing up fuel trucks and kidnapping drivers. Although the military junta is holding on for now, how long can they keep JNIM at bay is an open question.
Bamako is breathing through a narrow straw. A capital of 3 million kept alive by a trickle of fuel and the hope that its worst day has not yet arrived. For more than 2 months, fighters from the Al-Qaeda-linked JNIM group have tightened their grip on Mali's supply roads, burning scores of tankers, hijacking others, and cutting the flow of deliveries, once counted in the thousands, down to only a few hundred. In the capital, the blockade has slowed everything at once. Fuel prices are soaring, power is shrinking to a few hours a day, schools and hospitals are struggling to keep going, and food costs are rising as the city tries to push through each day. Beyond Bamako, the strain is sharper. Mopti and Bandiagara without power for weeks, Lere cut off, and key routes shifting in and out of armed control, leaving the north reliant on a fragile link through Niger, and from the capital, the message remains resolute.
Mali is here, Mali is standing. There are difficulties, there have been disruptions to the supply system. The state has organised itself, put in place a strategic plan to resume supply, to ensure convoy security, and more generally intensify military operations for the country's security. And gradually, you see hundreds of trucks arriving daily to resume supplying Bamako and other localities. And we will maintain these efforts.
But behind these reassurances lies a deeper story, one that began long before the blockade. For nearly a decade, France anchored Mali's fight against armed groups, until the coups of 2020 and 2021 ejected Paris and invited in the Wagner Group. The Russian contractors, later folded into Africa Corps, promised a harder campaign. Instead, rights groups accused them of abuses, while the armed group they were meant to contain now tightens its grip on the country's roads. Analysts say the blockade is exposing a truth the junta can no longer avoid. The security it promised is still nowhere to be found.
I believe that today it is clear that the military are facing challenges. Challenges on the economic front, but also challenges regarding to legitimacy. Let us remember that the main argument of these military leaders when they seized power through a coup was the claim that it was to provide security for the population. We see, a few years later, that security has not been achieved.
On the streets, frustration mixes with resignation. Many Malians say foreign powers, whether French or Russian, have offered little more than shifting alliances.
The French are in Mali for their own interests and not for those of Mali. Now, if they decide to leave because their interests are not being met, I don't think that's a problem. The Malians are now standing up to take charge of their own situation. This matter concerns only them. They can do what they want. We are here.
But foreign governments are leaving. The United States, Britain, France, Germany and Italy have urged citizens to go. The African Union warns of a rapidly deteriorating landscape. A collapse in Bamako could open the way to the first African state effectively governed by an Al-Qaeda-linked organization. And that possibility raises a sharper fear. A power vacuum in Bamako would not stay contained. It could redraw alliances across the Sahel, unsettle already fragile borders, and give an Al-Qaeda-linked organisation a level of territory and influence it has never held in Africa.
Well, joining me now from Geneva, Switzerland, is the Deputy Director of Global Operations at the UN Human Rights Office, Abdoul Aziz Thioye. Thanks very much for being with us. So let me ask you, first of all, what is your assessment right now of the human rights situation in Mali?
Thank you. The human rights situation in Mali is actually very worrying. We have concern about the escalating violence by armed group and also the serious violations associated with the military response to the threats posed by the armed group. Of course, on the side, the response by the military forces, but also the foreign military personnel. Also, the fact that we have really noticed the shrinking of the civic space, especially the ban of political parties, arrest and intimidation against journalists and civil society activists, and also the suspension of elections. These are very worrying. When there are threats posed to the peace and security in any given country with implications on human rights, the priority should be given to the respect of human rights, principles and norms to build trust and support for the whole of society.
And how are civilians, in particular in the capital Bamako, coping?
I think the concern we have is about the military operation. The fact that we have armed group actually expanding their area of operations and attacking civilians, and also the supply chain to Bamako. This is posing really threats to definitely the functioning of the hospitals, schools, and the transport systems. And of course, what really is really the priority actually is to protect the civilian and make sure that the access to the basic services is really continuing and maintained by the Malian authorities. So and also the fact that the civilians are actually trapped between the military operation, but also the attacked by the armed group.
Yeah, it is a very difficult situation for civilians there, particularly in the capital, Bamako, for all of the reasons that you mentioned there, not the least of which is, of course, this severe fuel shortage that they're dealing with right now. Talk to us a little bit about how the UN is dealing with all of this. Do you have people on the ground there? I mean, how are you responding to this in practically speaking?
There are ongoing efforts to engage and mobilize the countries in the region through the UN regional representation in West Africa, and also trying to mobilize efforts by the AU, but also from the regional ECOWAS and AES countries to definitely support and assist Mali to definitely tackle the threats posed by the armed group, and particularly the situation actually happening in Bamako. The priority is definitely to make sure that the Malian authorities make all their efforts to investigate abuses, ensure accountability, and align counterterrorism measures with human rights standards is extremely important. So any initiative aiming at really mobilizing the international community, countries in the region, to prevent any spillover of the conflict to the neighboring countries is definitely must be taken very seriously and supported.
And how, in your assessment, is that international mobilization progressing at this point with everything that's going on inside Mali right now? I mean, are the resources there to handle this?
We don't have the Human Rights Office does not have actually a team in the ground, but we are supporting efforts of the UNCT through the regional coordinator, but also fully coordinating our actions and engagement with the Malian authorities through the regional office in West Africa. We have a regional office based in Dakar, but also efforts by the representative of the Secretary General that is also based in Dakar, who's actually engaging with the Malian authorities with our support and the support of the entire UN system through, of course, the RC and the UNCT based in the country.
And what are the reports that you're getting on the situation there in the ground, particularly for civilians with everything that's going on there? You know, we've mentioned the lines of cars waiting to get petrol. Schools have been shut down. Hospitals are rationing power and so on. What are some of the accounts that you've been getting from people there?
We are following up closely the situation without entering into any kind of speculation. I know we can all imagine that any population, any societies really facing some kind of shortages in accessing to fuel, whom we know that it's very important for definitely what we call the adequate standard of living. The situation is extremely worrisome and concerning for the population actually in Bamako. But as I said, we cannot speculate. Better to really focus on what the information we can definitely corroborate and confirm. But the priority is now in terms of given to the engagement with the authorities through the initiative that is actually underway, as I said.
Good to talk to you, Abdoul Aziz Thioye from the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now to talk more about this from Dakar, we have Francophone Africa security analyst Beverly Ochieng. Joining us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in the US, professor of anthropology at Lehigh University and a former Peace Corps volunteer in Mali from 1997 to 2000, Bruce Whitehouse. And from Newport, Wales in the UK, West Africa regional editor at the Conversation publication, Adjouen Soyinka. Thanks very much for being with us. Beverly, let me start with you then. So just broadly speaking, does the Malian military government have a grip on the situation right now? How do you think they are handling this?
Well, as we're speaking, there has been some form of resupplying of fuel into Bamako. And part of the reason for the focus on Bamako, in particular for the military government, is to ensure that they limit socioeconomic grievances arising from the fuel blockade. There have been concerns that if there are prolonged shortages, if economic activities continue to slow down, we're likely to see unrest and even more rhetoric against the military-led government. So they've been very cautious about ensuring that fuel convoys are prioritized for Bamako, that they advertise fuel points, that they're able to continue advocating triumphalist narratives around the blockade in a way to discredit the militants who are sustaining pressure on the capital in order to reduce any legitimacy threats that they are facing, because this is, and I don't like this word, quite unprecedented since the insurgency started.
Bruce Whitehouse, what's your take on the situation there right now and how much control the government has on things?
Well, I definitely agree with Ms. Ochieng. I think this is the most serious security crisis that the government of Mali has faced, at least in the last 10 years, certainly going back to 2012. There are manifold threats to security throughout the country. And we heard about Bamako, but let's not forget that 80% of Malians live in rural areas, and they are under severe and growing threats of insecurity from fighters, from the security forces, from Russian paramilitaries. Thousands of them have fled Mali, some going north to Mauritania, some going south to Cote d'Ivoire. Just in recent weeks, we've had new influxes of refugees into those countries. So what happens in the capital is certainly very important for the political future of the Malian government, but what's happening in the interior of the country is just as important.
Adjouen Soyinka, what's your assessment of the situation there?
I mean, I totally agree with Ochieng, and the situation is quite dire, and it's the type that we haven't seen in that region in recent years. It's such that there's a lot of debate around, okay, who's actually in control. But what I've also noticed is the tendency of the military government in Bamako to portray the situation as one in which they are in charge, as one in which they are fighting against some kind of, entrenched corrupt, Western influenced governance system, and also fighting against the jihadist threat in itself. And you see the tendency for the government to portray itself as one that's definitely defending the national sovereignty of Mali. But that hasn't been an easy task for the government in Bamako at the moment. But then if we've all focused on Bamako, there's a lot that's going on in the northern part of Mali, in central Mali. A lot of these have been going on for some years without so much of media focus. There's a lot of media focus now because of the blockade of fuel and other supplies to the capital city. But one has to also think about what has been happening in the local regions for many years before now.
Beverly Ochieng, there does also seem to be an information war going on here as well in Mali, because you've got the government on one side trying to convince the public that they are on top of this and trying to fight this narrative that presumably JNIM is promoting of chaos and shortages there.
Well, yes. I mean, over the course of the insurgency, the information war has always been a prevalent point to either give legitimacy to the government or to legitimize other parties. However, the Al-Qaeda group in particular has been really sustaining its outreach to the people of Mali, not just in Bamako, but the southern regions, as a way of reducing support for the military, as well as undermining the authority of the military government. In fact, the most recent statement by one of the leading figures, a spokesperson who's based in the southern region, he spoke about the fact that the military has been facing setbacks, the fact that it's not been forthcoming with information, and the government has had a lot of control over the kinds of narratives coming out and the discourse around the fuel shortages. For one, they've been summoning officials or station media outlets that are reporting on military setbacks, instances where people are being displaced. Transport unions have been appearing on television to express support for the military government's efforts towards securing fuel supplies into the capital. There's been more positive narratives, and then more increasingly, at least since the start of November, when fuel supplies in the capital alone appeared to somewhat stabilize, there was less focus on the militant blockade, on the concerns around fuel, to create a sense of normalcy. And this has meant that it's very difficult to get authentic narratives coming from the country. In addition to this, you also have other social media users who are using that space to propagate positive narratives in support of the military government and discrediting other people as either being supported by the West. I mean, even I've been singled out as an alleged Western puppet for reflecting on what this blockade is doing to daily life, economic constraints, but also the counter narratives that are becoming a lot more widespread on social and mainstream media.
Adaju Soyinka, if we talk a little bit more about JNIM and their origins and what their goals are in all this, because they have been fighting a war on and off against the government there for over a decade now. Is their goal to take over the country completely and to run it themselves, or is it to create a kind of leverage with the government to get what they want?
Well, I mean, if we look at the founding aim of JNIM and even Al-Qaeda that it kind of affiliated with, they've always been clear about wanting to establish a global Islamic caliphate governed by Sharia law. So that's always been their aim. And given the opportunity, they would love to want to take control of the country. and obviously targeting the resources of the country in itself. In fact, given the opportunity, they would love to take over the control of the entire region, because JNIM is not has not restricted its activities to only Mali. The entire region is facing, attacks from these terror groups. Nigeria, in effect, even experienced the first attack of JNIM, I think in August or so, and they actually announced that, so they are driven by motive to take control of the country, to establish an Islamic caliphate governed by Sharia law, and to be able to also propagate that across the entire region. That's the challenge that the region is facing. Unfortunately, this is happening at a time when there isn't much coordination amongst the countries in the region. The division in ECOWAS, of course, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger pulled out of ECOWAS. Of course, you've seen the anti-French sentiment that's going on in the entire region as well. So these terror groups are exploiting these gaps and basically trying to foist their own agenda in the midst of that confusion that's going on in the region.
Bruce Whitehouse, I saw you nodding in agreement to some of that, but I want to ask you as well, just kind of taking a bird's eye view of all this, because it's easy to take the view that foreign actors like Russia, for example, like the regional group ECOWAS and former colonial powers like France, have all had a hand in shaping Mali's instability. Is that a fair criticism? Does Mali actually need support from outside?
So let's address the question of external influence on this conflict. The Malian military regime has been very successful in framing the conflict, at least to their own people and to many of their supporters abroad, as driven by neo-colonial forces, that this insurgency is being imposed upon it from the outside, particularly by France and possibly by some of Mali's neighbors as well. And so they've been able to mobilize political support among Malians at home and in the diaspora, and among some people abroad as well, for their regime, because they're positioning themselves as opposed to this foreign-driven neo-colonial infringement on their sovereignty. But at the same time, that framing ignores very real grievances that people inside Mali have, that has made it possible for JNIM to recruit thousands of fighters among rural dwellers, particularly Fulani pastoralists, who've not been treated well by the government, whose people have been subject to all kinds of abuses of power and arbitrary authority and judicial corruption for years, since independence. I've seen no willingness from the Malian authorities to talk about these problems, let alone to address them. And as long as they frame the conflict as stemming from outside their borders, I think the real roots of this insurgency are going to go unaddressed.
Beverly Ochieng, where does Mali go from here then? I mean, does the public have enough faith in the government to maintain control here?
I mean, there's possibly three scenarios. One is where we see the fuel blockade being prolonged over a period of time, 6 months to even 1 year, given that JNIM is increasing its reinforcements around Bamako. This might be also sustained with symbolic attacks directed towards the capital in particular, not to seize control, but to continue undermining the military-led government. This is one way of trying to drive grievances against the military government and possibly try to push for either mass protests or another military coup. Which brings us to a second scenario whereby you might find that the military government, as a result of its difficulty and constraints with being able to withhold power and legitimacy, might be toppled in a subsequent military coup. In this scenario, we might see a sort of change in strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy, trying to find a way of fighting back militants while also winning public legitimacy. And this is likely to arise from the military forces themselves, some of whom do have grievances about the counterinsurgency campaign. The worst case scenario is whereby you do have a besieged situation whereby repeated attacks take place in strategic areas, and then you have chaos and a fallout where there's no clarity on political solutions. However, there's still the role of the regional and international community. Even though Mali and its neighbors left the Economic Community of West African States, there are still concerns of the militancy spreading to neighboring countries. So having diplomatic and security lifelines and consolidation, because in as much as Mali has become a lot more isolated, there have been notes of concern by Senegal, by Togo, who are acting as mediators, the wider regional community, and even some comments by the US. And then barring that, continued consolidation by the three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as they face off a mutual threat.
All right, well, we'll be certainly following how all of this does play out in Mali and beyond, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Beverly Ochieng, Bruce Whitehouse, and Adejiwun Soyinka. Thanks very much for being on the Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.